Welcome to our world, the world of brass model trains. A world that is so diverse and mysterious in the culture that it was derived from. A land where dragons roamed and folklore has been handed down from generations to generations for thousands of years. A world that started in a fishing village to bringing us here at the Expo in Chicago. Today, we'll discuss how these two worlds found each other and how you, as a customer, play an important role in continuing its rich history. The first question a lot of you have asked is, why Chicago? Well, one morning I was rudely awoken out of bed by Dan and Roland, and they asked, hey, where should the expo be? Well, without hesitation, I said Chicago. Roland immediately asked, why Chicago? I responded, because they have the best pizza in the world. So Roland responded and said, well, I know that, but what do pizza and brass trains have in common? Then I asked Roland, I says, what's the difference between a large pizza and being a brass importer? After a moment of silence, I told him you can feed a family of 4 off of a large pizza. But all kidding aside, why did I choose Chicago? Well, during the heyday of the mid-'70s, PFM and Westside models had a kind of a competition, an ad campaign, as it were. It was called the Battle of the Ks. And what it was a sort of a kind of a friendly competition, if you want to call it that, who could make the best detailed HON3 K36. It was a pretty amazing time at that period, but later on I had the opportunity to discuss this project with Don Drew and Bob Longnecker one day over lunch. And they were telling me about the progression of the project and whatnot, and I made a comment that you're probably sending truckloads of K36s out to Colorado, thinking that that's where the target market would be. Well, that's when Don made a surprising comment to me that I never forgot. He said most of them ended up in the Midwest, in the greater Chicago area. And then they went on to say that a large portion of their imports throughout the years ended up here in the Midwest, mainly in the Chicago area. So we can appreciate that it would be only the right thing to do is to hold this expo in Chicago, the hub of where most of the brass imports showed up. So we want to appreciate that a lot of work has been done throughout the years of importing, but we need to take you back to that world that we started discussing at the opening of this discourse, a world where it all began, that little tiny fishing village in Japan. But in order to appreciate the models, you have to first appreciate the people who built them and their culture. You can search the world over and you'll find no other place on the earth such as the Orient. The first and foremost fact is the tools of their craft. Back in the 17th century, a new material was brought to them. Unlike copper, which is a metal, brass was an alloy. Brass had been used to make tools and decorative items since the Bible times. But now this process developed where they could use different alloys, and the world would change from then on. As tool making and metalworking progressed through the centuries, brass items prevailed, such as functional and decorative items, such as bathroom fixtures, like faucets and taps, along with lighting fixtures, such as chandeliers. And then with the continuing development of these alloys, brass was starting to be used as sand casting. Although the surface was very rough at the time by today's standard, very complex shapes could be duplicated and thus allowed for production of brass items to begin in the open market. Another big invention was that of the precision-sized brass sheet, or the thickness of those sheets were continually being processed to a precision thickness. These sheets were, back then, were mainly used as patterns and templates for manufacturing from anything from clothing to furniture. But it didn't take long for those who were working in those fields to start making models out of scrap. Historian Alfred Whitehead once said, "Items or ideas won't keep. Something must be done about them." And that's exactly what happened. Craftsmen of their trade started building brass boats and ship models. Although very rudimentary from what we see today, it was the beginning of the brass model artisan. Initially, the tools of the trade were very crude saws, files, and shaped pieces of iron that were heated in coal and were used as soldering apparatuses. Hence today we have the name soldering iron. Early model makers rarely involved anything that was round because of the tools of their trade, they weren't able to make round objects. And so as the model making spread from tiny fishing villages into the more populated, more educated areas of Japan, we saw that the models started increasing in quality. One important development was the brass string. Today we call that brass wire, but they started making it in various sizes, and modelers were now able to start adding three-dimensional parts to their models, such as rigging for ships and boats, and rigging for like airplane wings. And so then it went on and on from there. And these, in the Japanese term, were called shaosai, and that was translated details. And so now we started seeing detail models. Some of the artisans had a passion for trains, although they were building models of other things. And they really appreciated the attributes of the locomotives, especially steam locomotives at the time. But once again, they were bounded by these round shapes involved making a steam locomotive. Some of these men were watchmakers and jewelers and had the required tools to turn rudimentary objects simulating different parts of a locomotive. But now that we have an understanding of the tools and materials, that we need to appreciate the qualities and attributes of the men and who they are. Qualities that would mold them as skilled craftsmen and would dedicate their entire lives to building of models. Skills that would be handed down from generation to generation. These men in time developed a sense of scale. Prior to this, the models might have been almost caricatures. But as these artisans developed, they started saying, hey, you know, this cab has to match this boiler. There's a proportion there. And so that sense of scale started being developed. They were able to visualize into a 3D thoughts on how to execute a locomotive from just pieces of brass. They pursued their art and developed new techniques every time they built a model. The next one was always better, even through a small production run of maybe 6 to 10 pieces. The first one would be pretty good. The second one would be better. By the time they finished the sixth one, it didn't even hardly look like the first one detail-wise because they kept advancing. They also had a sense for the materials and tools that were at hand and how they were going to use them. Oftentimes, a tool that may not have been intended for its original purpose. For instance, the sewing machine. Somebody thought about making rivets with that sewing machine. And other tools and machinery were turned into items for like lathes and milling machines. One of the most important things they developed over time was a passion for the detail. And another passion that they had was the finish work of the models. If we look at some of the models in the museum, or we're familiar with some of the older Japanese models, the finish and the quality of the brass, the way they finished out the model with whatever tools they used to polish the brass. Sometimes they brushed it with steel brushes. And so each builder kind of had his own finish, as it were, so you could tell the builders apart. They also had a natural ability to link abstract ideas and to interpret those ideas into models, oftentimes with very limited information, perhaps just one photograph. Sometimes not even that. Sometimes we always use the phrase napkin sketch. Sometimes they were just using very rudimentary artwork to produce something. So now that we have a good background on the modelers' thinking, how they grew as far as time went with their thoughts and the passion, along with the materials and tools they used to build these models, we can unveil some of its mysteries on how brass trains came to be and how they were constructed then and now and also in the future. We need to have a small little history about rail transportation in Japan. It had been known because of the Dutch trading that went into Dejima and Nagasaki. The impact of model railroads brought by the foreigners into those towns was huge. The British even demonstrated early on an actual steam locomotive in Nagasaki to help the country begin their rail system. Isn't that interesting that model railroads played a big part in the country for developing their national railway system? In 1872, the government of Japan decided to build a railway using British financing, and 300 British and European technical advisors, civil engineers, general managers, and locomotive builders and drivers. These men also brought with them their hobbies, items which were far more advanced than they were building at the time or they had even seen. It didn't take very long for Japanese toy manufacturers to start popping up all over the place. By the late 1950s, Japan was known for producing low-cost toys for production and for export. On one of my first trips to Japan, I had the pleasure of visiting some of the old-time builders. Although they were getting up there in age, they were more than willing to share some of these stories or folklore of early brass construction. The first non-toy-like scale models were kind of born during the occupation of the Allies in Japan during World War II. Members of the Allied forces saw some of the models built by the various artisans and craftsmen, and so they started bringing photos of American prototype steam locomotives for them to model. Can you imagine today taking one photograph and handing it to somebody and having them say, hey, I need a big boy next week before I leave? It was a very impressive feat. We have some examples of those in the museum today, men who built these models on a photo or two, so we can really appreciate the art involved in producing those. These are early hand-built, we'll call them early hand-built models. They were built by various craftsmen, and they were high-quality models at the time because before that, the models were relatively crude in comparison. And as the tools became available, the models developed later on. But the first models were mainly built out of brass sheet and turnings. In fact, one interesting story was one of these very first models had drivers made from the primer end of shells used in Japanese aircraft. And what they did is they cut the backs of them off, and so that little rim, the retainer rim on the shell, served as the wheel flange. But more importantly, the centered primer area of the shell was concentric with the outer diameter precision, and so they were able to apply axles to them and make drivers that rolled pretty smooth. So we can see the ingenuity that they used. It took a lot of creativity to figure out some of these parts. Some of the first models were scaled according to the shell diameter that they could be used for the drivers. And so some of the models weren't exactly like, as we're used to HO scale or double O or O scale. They were just proportioned to the drivers. And so as time went on, GIs demanded more scale fidelity, and they wanted the models to run. And so motors and gearboxes had to be developed primarily by watchmakers so that they could get these models to run. And so as they started progressing, castings were starting to be used. And as I mentioned earlier about the casting process, at first it was sand castings, very crude and rough castings, but we can see on some of the early handmades, we can see how some of these things were made, primarily driver centers, domes, and tender trucks, so that models could be made in small quantities. And when we say production, we're talking 6 to 10 pieces most of the time. It also aided them into producing the small runs of the locomotive, because if somebody brought a big boy over from Japan and said, look what I have, guess what? Other people wanted that too. And so this helped the artisans to duplicate many details on a locomotive so that they could use it in production. Some experts think that on some of these early handmades that perhaps only 10% of these models survive in the world today. So we can appreciate how special they are. As time went on, the lost wax casting process came about. Although not a new process, it had been refined. Investment casting is an industrial process based upon lost wax casting, one of the oldest forms of metal making known. The history of lost wax casting dates back thousands of years. The earliest were used for idols, ornaments, and jewelry, using natural beeswax for patterns and clay for the molds, and manually operated hand bellows furnaces so they could pour the metal. Examples have been seen across the world of this process. For instance, King Tut's exhibit that some of the parts were made in 1324 BC. Mesopotamia, Aztec, and the Mayan ruins all have examples of lost wax castings where the process produced detailed work from copper, bronze, and gold. Investment casting later on came into its modern industrial process in the late 19th century when dentists began using it for crowns and inlays. It was accelerated by a man named William Taggart, happened to be here from Chicago, whose 1907 paper described his development of the technique that he started formulating what we know today as the wax pattern compound, the investment materials, and he also invented the air pressure casting machine. From then, the war broke out, and in the 1940s, the World War II demand for precision and net-shaped manufacturing and specialized alloys and casting helped bring this investment casting process to the forefront. Industry turned to investment casting after the war, and it was used to spread to many commercial and industrial applications for making very complex parts. Well, we can find out that it didn't take long for them to start using this process so that we could have lost wax castings added to our models. The artisans saw the use of lost wax castings as a competitive edge in producing models of the highest quality and finish. And so when some of these model makers, as it were, started producing models with castings, the ones that were left behind with turnings and sand castings had no competitive edge anymore. And so some of these guys started merging with one another. Soon, people in the model railroad industry started taking note of these beautiful handmade models and wanted to produce or bring them to the U.S. The scale of importing increased as popularity gained with these brass models, and it began to revolutionize the scale model train hobby in the United States. Bill Ryan of Pacific Fast Mail was one of the very early importers, and to this day, the name PFM is synonymous with brass model trains. As the 1960s drew to an end, importers started providing new factories with real builder drawings, data packages as we called it, with photos, detail photos. This area provided interesting times as men over there were artisans. They were not engineers. They did not know how to read a blueprint of a locomotive. And so it didn't take very long for these men to realize that they're going to have an engineer work for them to help them to design these models so that they could produce them. So we appreciated that they started developing a staff to read these drawings so that the models could be as accurate to a degree as the standards allowed them for that time. As the popularity of model railroading increased, the demand became more and more for better locomotives was apparent. The builders saw a need to merge their talents in order to keep up with the demand. So now these model shops, as they were called, began taking on a new industrial look, including machine shops, pattern makers, and forms of assembly lines. The quality of the Japanese models continued to improve over the years, and also with an improving domestic economy, manufacturing cost also increased. Although the quality of the Japanese models were at its epic peak point, eventually importers were forced to move their operations to Korea because of cost benefits. Although the quality suffered considerably in the early years of this transition, within a few years, some very fine brass models were being built. In the very early 1980s, a visit to Sam Hongsa netted an eye-opening experience. At the time, Sam Hongsa decided to build a modern factory, utilizing state-of-the-art equipment and doing everything in-house. At the time, Sam Hongsa decided that they had suffered long enough with making substandard models. And so the founder of Sam Hongsa, Mr. Sang-Man Lee, and his son Se-Young Lee decided to restructure the business and make it into a modern factory. And once again, we walked in there and it was like a state-of-the-art factory compared to anything that had been seen before. Even though the production of parts and materials were being done on a mass scale, the production line still consisted of workers, mainly young women brought in from the farmlands. They were just soldering castings on etched pieces of brass or sheet brass, no different than the makers of models 100 years prior to that. Soon, a young engineer working for Sam Hongsa named Cho Nam-dal would leave the company and start his own factory, naming it Ajin. He used his engineering talents in designing some of the best forming dies, in which allowed him to produce massive diesels on a scale that just had never been said before. And I think you know the rest of that story. Another young engineer also cut his teeth with Sam Hongsa for 3 years, Mr. Seiho Jang, and he later became employed with Ajin. After a 12-year stint with Mr. Cho, he too decided to form his own company, Bu-Rim Precision. Seiho survived out of the ashes of both Sam Hongsa and Ajin closing its doors. Another company sprung out of the fall of the big builders, Mr. Chan He, helped create Sam Model Tech. So where do we go from here? Will we see robots building brass models in the future? Highly unlikely. Today, we are seeing some of the best models produced ever. The factories are now using state-of-the-art CAD programs. Some of them are just now utilizing three-dimensional drawing to create these 3D models before they are produced. Computer-aided etching machines are developed and being developed as we talk today, and they're making the most intricate artwork that you can see on a sheet of brass ever to be rendered. Computer-driven milling machines and lathes are producing patterns on an exacting scale in an effort to bring you the finest models to date. Folks, even with all of this technology, your brass models are still being built by hand using the same techniques brought to you by the first fishermen in Japan. They still utilize the big soldering irons. It's amazing the work they do with that. But what does this say about our industry and the men and women who bring their models inside our homes for our enjoyment? They enjoy what they do because they are good at it. This has been evident down through the years. It's a commitment to test their knowledge through years of experience, persistence, and the willingness to learn from their mistakes. Do you not appreciate their efforts for the men here from Korea? Well, how do you fit in to all of this? You play the biggest part in the story. You are the holder of these fine pieces, a collector of art that has been handed down from generations to generations. Now, when we say collectors around here, we sort of use it as a loose term, but some people take it very serious. But whether you're a collector that has your brass models displayed on a wall, or you're a modeler that has a collection of Union Pacific or Burlington Northern diesels on your layout, you are still a collector, whether you run them on your layout or you have them on your wall. You're collecting something for a purpose. And so you're playing a big part in showcasing this art. Art that is available to anyone who appreciates it, from the common man to the wealthiest individuals on this earth. Kings and princes own some of these brass models. Each of us hold that item and look at the talents and skills that were developed through the ancient of times. Little pieces of brass soldered us together to form something, brought us here this weekend. Did you ever think that journey would take us from a tiny little fishing village in Japan to the Brass Expo here, 2016 in Chicago? But what about the future? Can you imagine model railroading without brass trains? If it weren't for brass models and the people who imported them and the people who built them, the hobby of model railroading would not be the same today. We would not have models of our favorite prototypes. Every version of a steam locomotive built, except for a Frisco 1500, but our every phase and road name of a diesel. Our models would be lacking in detail and sophistication that we're all used to today. Maybe most of us would not even be model railroaders if it wasn't for the brass models. I know I wouldn't. So, well, we won't have to worry about that. True, in the scene of brass model is changing. It's changing throughout the years. But as we look forward, the technology will bring us into the future. As CAD software and machinery continue to advance, so will our models. We are looking at processes that even James T. Kirk didn't have available on the USS Enterprise. As 3D printing technology advances, we'll see more and more of that craft utilized in our models. From the making of wax masters to the actual forming of brass parts ready to assemble. Very soon, the possibility that an entire chassis, yes, frame, cylinders, journal boxes, and drivers can be grown out of a pile of brass dust the size of baby powder to the exact size that we need by a laser beam, fusing these together to make a complete working chassis. We will look forward to witnessing the continuation of the history of brass models as technology progresses. Well, friends, my time has run out, but I want you to do something. I want you to go out and look at the museum, pay attention to some of the older models on display or for sale, and I want you to appreciate the quality and the work that has gone on. I want to get out there and buy some brass models too, and so somebody distract my wife while I go do that. But you've been a great audience. But take a look at some of those older models. Forget that it's a model train and study it. Look at how the model was crafted. And then say, could I have done that myself? What tools did he use? How did he build it from maybe one photograph? Go back through that museum and look at the collection from a new viewpoint. Look at an early handmade big boy, as it were. I think the coolest thing in that museum is probably those excavators. It doesn't have to be a brass model train to appreciate the artisans that produce this stuff for us. I would also like to say a few words on behalf of the importers here in the audience and some of the builders who flew all the way from Korea to meet you. They didn't come from us or for us. They can see us all the time. They can talk to us all the time. They came here for you, friends. And so we appreciate that. Yes, we truly enjoy what we do. Sometimes it seems like it's the hardest job on earth, and we ask ourselves every day, why do we do this? But that question is answered every time we deliver a run of models to you, the customer, the collector, the model railroader, who receives a model that provides a source of enjoyment for you in the years to come. Thank you.